You are now standing on a street in Germany in the 1930s, in a place and time that was the beginning of what would later be called the Holocaust. The exhibition you're about to see is about the Nazis' plundering, one of the biggest plunderings in history, which was done for both economic reasons and as a way to deprive people of their culture and ultimately human dignity. As you can see, the exhibition is divided into 5 parts. Click on a part to enter, look around and explore what you see. You can interact with many art objects and other things in the exhibition. Just click on an object and I will tell you about it. The opening to the 1,000-year-old salt mine in Altaussee in Austria was only large enough for one man at a time to wriggle through. First in were Robert Posey and Lincoln Kirstein, 2 American soldiers who belonged to the special units of the Western Allied Army that went by the name the Monuments Men. They looked into the darkness, uncertain of what awaited them. They had heard rumors, but were they really true? In front of them lay a huge cave system which stretched several kilometers into the mountain. The first thing that met them was an iron door that had been broken off by an explosion. Further on, stacked on a few simple boxes, rested one of the world's foremost works of art, the Flemish masterpiece, the Ghent altarpiece, by Jan and Hubert van Eyck, which was nearly 5 meters wide. The miraculous jewels of the Virgin Mary's crown seemed to attract the glaring lights of our torches, Kirstein wrote later. In the glow, they also saw the milky white color of Italian marble. On a dirty mattress lay one of Michelangelo's statues from the first year of the 16th century, the so-called Madonna in Bruges. Inside the mountain, one of the world's most amazing art collections came to light. Over 6,000 paintings and sculptures, but also priceless medieval books, antiquities, tapestries, coin collections and many other items. Thousands of works of art were labeled A.H. Linz. It was Adolf Hitler's private art collection intended for the monumental museum that Hitler had planned to build in Linz, the Führer Museum. But the discovery in Altaussee was, despite its scope, only a small part of a much larger crime. Between 1933 and 1945, the most extensive looting of cultural objects in world history had been carried out. Millions of works of art and antiquities and over 100 million books were stolen. Special looting units were sent across Europe to confiscate the most important and valuable art collections, libraries and archives. Not only were masterpieces by Rembrandt, Rubens and Van Gogh stolen, but also children's books, pianos, jewelry and personal letters. Nazi looting was part of the Holocaust machinery. It was driven by greed and the quest for economic gain, but also undertaken for ideological reasons. The looting took away people's opportunities to flee and resist, but they were also a theft of culture, identity, language and context. Plundering was a weapon to humiliate and deprive people of their dignity and humanity. Millions of the stolen items were never returned after World War II. Today, Holocaust survivors and their struggle to regain these objects make up an important part of a personal and historical reconciliation process. The Ghent altarpiece is an altar cabinet that was created by the brothers Hubert and Jan van Eyck in the 15th century. During the war, the painting was stolen at Adolf Hitler's personal request from the Cathedral of St. Bavo in Ghent, Belgium, Webb Gallery of Art. The Ghent altarpiece was found after the war in the salt mine in Altaussee in Austria. Since the 1930s, objects plundered by the Nazis have found their way into public collections all over the world. The trade in books, musical instruments, paintings and sculptures that were looted from victims of the Nazis has been going on throughout the post-war period. In this way, stolen objects have also ended up in countries that did not directly take part in the war, such as Sweden. In 2012, an art collection of nearly 1,500 items came to light in Munich at the home of Cornelius Görlitz, son of one of the leading art dealers in Nazi Germany. How much of the works in the collection was plundered by the Nazis is still being investigated. Several works of art, including some by André Matisse, have been returned to Jewish descendants. Cornelius Görlitz had been selling artwork from the collection since the 1960s. In recent decades, the issue of so-called Nazi-plundered objects have received increasing attention. Since the late 1990s, museums, institutions, auction houses and collectors all over the world have returned tens of thousands of items that were looted during World War II. One case that has attracted a lot of attention is that of Gustav Klimt's painting, Portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauer I. The painting was stolen from the Bloch-Bauer family after Nazi Germany's annexation of Austria in 1938. The painting ended up at the Gallery Belvedere Art Museum in Vienna, while Hermann Göring seized the valuable necklace worn by Adele Bloch-Bauer in the painting. He gave it as a present to his wife, Emmy Göring. In 2000, Maria Altmann sued Austria to regain the painting and 4 other paintings by Gustav Klimt. Altmann was the niece and heir of Adele Bloch-Bauer's husband Ferdinand. She herself had been forced to flee Austria in the late 1930s. The case of Republic of Austria versus Altmann went all the way up to the United States Supreme Court. In 2006, Austria returned all the paintings to Maria Altmann. The portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauer can be viewed today at the New Gallery in New York. In 2015, the story was filmed in The Woman in Gold with Helen Mirren starring as Maria Altmann. The Madonna in Bruges by Michelangelo was made between 1501 and 1504. In 1944, it was stolen by German soldiers from the Church of Our Lady in Bruges in Belgium. The sculpture was found after the war in Alsace in Austria. In April 1946, Leonardo da Vinci's Lady with an Ermine was returned to Poland. Frank P. Albright, Everett Parker Leslie, and Joe D. Espinosa from the Monuments Men, along with the Polish officer and art historian Karol Estrisio. Adolf Hitler shows Hermann Göring the Falconer by the 19th century painter Hans Makart. Hitler had bought the painting legally from the art dealer Karl Haberstock. At midnight on May 10, 1933, book fires were ignited throughout Germany. In Berlin, 40,000 people gathered to see the burning of books at the public square Opernplatz, where propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels spoke. "You are right to allow the flames to consume the evil spirits of the past at this midnight hour." Books by authors like Thomas Mann, Stefan Zweig and Franz Kafka were cast into the fire. The burning of the books has in posterity come to be a symbol of the Nazis' destruction of and contempt for culture. But the truth is that the Nazis looted far more books than they burned. The burning of the books was primarily a symbolic spectacle, not a mass destruction of books. As early as in 1933, a start was made to the looting of art, books, instruments, antiquities and other cultural objects, which in the end would cover most of Europe. An SA soldier throws books onto the bonfire, Opernplatz, Berlin, May 10, 1933. Aryan art and culture stood above all other cultures, according to Nazi ideologists. In their view, it was a direct expression of the superiority of the Aryan race. Therefore, culture was of great importance in the Nazi Germany. New museums, concert halls and libraries were built and planned for the future. Adolf Hitler, in the late 1930s, after the annexation of Austria, made plans to turn the Austrian city of Linz into a grand cultural city, a Nazi Florence. The center would become the huge museum Hitler intended to build, the Führer Museum. Plans were also made for immense libraries and an entirely Nazi university in southern Germany, Hohe Schule der NSDAP. Common to these projects was that the collection would be built up through extensive looting. The picture shows the planned Führer Museum in Linz, Austria. German students and SA loot Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld's library at the Institute for Sexual Science, May 6, 1933. Modern art, a Jewish conspiracy. Nazi propaganda spread the image that modern art, which had had its major breakthrough in the 1920s, was a Jewish conspiracy. Behind the supposed plot were the Jewish press and Jewish journalists, intellectuals and art dealers. Its purpose was, according to the Nazis, to trick Germans into accepting fake art and confuse them. One of those pointed to in this conspiracy was Alfred Fleckheim. In the spring of 1933, art dealer Alfred Fleckheim was forced to flee Germany after one of his auctions in Düsseldorf had been attacked by brown shirts from the SA, the forerunner of the SS. Alfred Fleckheim had been one of the between wars most famous and successful art dealers. He had sold work of the greatest artists of the time, such as Pablo Picasso, André Matisse, Paul Klee and Max Ernst. Nazi propaganda had targeted Alfred Fleckheim for several years. He was accused of destroying German culture. When Fleckheim fled, he left his art galleries and a great art collection. Shortly after, his company was taken over by his Aryan employee, Alex Vermel. Alfred Fleckheim died in exile in London in 1937. Alfred Fleckheim was one of thousands of German Jews who, during the 1930s, were subjected to Aryanization arising. This was a term used in Nazi Germany and later in occupied countries for the confiscation and theft of Jewish property that was transferred to Aryan possession. Aryanization could take on many forms, from pure theft to forced sale, extortion, and the special punishment taxes that Jews were forced to pay. Aryanization was a way of excluding Jews from society by keeping them out of certain professions, education, and public life. It was also a means of forcing Jews to emigrate and an important source of income for the German state. In the picture, you can see Alfred Fleckheim. The photo is taken 1911. Plundering of a Jewish home. Everywhere around us, we see the monstrous offspring of madness, rudeness, incompetence, and pure degeneration. What this exhibition shows awakens in horror within us all. Adolf Ziegler at the opening of the Antarktische Kunst exhibition in 1937. At the start of the summer of 1937, the Nazis embarked upon the extensive clearing out of art in German museums. All art that the party perceived as modern and abstract was seized. Works by artists of Jewish origin or by artists regarded as anti-religious were confiscated. Altogether, 17,000 works of art were removed from German museums. In July 1937, 1,000 of the confiscated items were exhibited in the Antarktische Kunst exhibition in Munich. The purpose of the exhibition was to deflame the art that the Nazis regarded as degenerate, morbid, and disruptive to society. Nazi ideologists made a direct link between racial politics and aesthetics. Art and culture that broke the natural order was seen as dangerous and alien. One of those who lay behind these ideas was the art historian and Nazi Paul Schulze-Naumburg. In his book Art and Race, 1928, he compared works of art by, among others, Picasso and Matisse with pictures of people with physical disabilities. Not long after art had been cleared out of German museums, the T4 euthanasia program was started, killing hundreds of thousands of people with physical and mental disabilities. The two projects were united by the ideology of racial biology. The pictures show Emil Nolde's The Life of Christ in the Antarktische Kunst exhibition, a poster for the exhibition, and photos from the book Art and Race. It's like an automated factory, let's say like a flour mill with a bakery. At one end, you put in a Jew who still has capital, a factory, a shop or a bank account. And he passes through the whole building from counter to counter, from office to office, and when he gets out at the other end, he has no money, no rights, only a passport where it's written, "You must leave the country within 2 weeks. If you don't, you will be sent to a concentration camp." SS officer Wilhelm Höttl about the bureaucracy responsible for plundering Vienna's Jews in 1938. The forms of looting had taken shape as early as in the 1930s, not least after the annexation of Austria in 1938, when SS officer Adolf Eichmann built up an extensive plundering bureaucracy. 2 years later, the looting operation was moved on a larger scale to the occupied Netherlands, Belgium and France. The plundering also included countries such as Norway, Italy and Yugoslavia, and would continue until the end of the war. Ultimately, millions of people would be deprived of their property. More than 30,000 train carriages of books, art, furniture and other stolen items were transported from the occupied countries in the west to Germany. In 1942, the deportation of Western Europe's Jewish population to concentration and extermination camps in Eastern Europe began on a large scale. Ultimately, 76,000 men, women and children would be sent east from France, about 100,000 from the Netherlands and about 25,000 from Belgium. At the same time, the Furniture Action operation was initiated. In France, Belgium and the Netherlands, 69,619 homes belonging to deported Jews were emptied of all household goods. Furniture, art, bedding, cutlery, toys and children's books. Over 26,000 freight wagons were required to take the items to Germany. The picture shows stolen items from M Action in Paris. They were the only copies of books and manuscripts from the time before the birth of Jesus Christ, from the time of the Roman emperors and the early popes. There were engravings from the Middle Ages, books from the first printing presses, and documents that have gone from hand to hand throughout history. Robert Katz, Black Sabbath. During the morning of October 13, 1943, the Jewish Congregation Library in Rome, Biblioteca della Comunità Israelitica, was loaded onto 2 German freight wagons. The collection then disappeared without trace. In 2002, a state commission was set up in Italy to try and find out what happened. The library, which is regarded as one of the most important Jewish collections in the world, has yet to be found. The picture shows a book from 1745 at Centro Bibliografico in Rome. One of the foremost works of art stolen in France was Johannes Vermeer's Astronomer from 1668. Only 30 or so works by the artist have been preserved. The painting was stolen from the French line of the Rothschild family, whose famous art collection amounted to 5,000 works. Adolf Hitler chose the painting for his planned art museum in Linz. Wanda Landowska's home in Saint-Lô-la-Forêt outside Paris was described as a music temple, a paradise where thousands of people from all over the world traveled to take music lessons and listen to the Bach and Mozart concerts she held in her garden every summer. Landowska was a pianist and a harpsichordist and a well-known music researcher. She owned a unique collection of antique instruments and a library with over 10,000 volumes. At the end of May 1940, the music fell silent when German armies broke through the French front line. Wanda Landowska, who was over 60 years old, wanted to stay in France, but was persuaded to flee by her partner, the musician Denis Restou, who realized the danger. When we started hearing the fighting just a couple of miles away, we decided it was time to flee. We packed a couple of suitcases with clothes, books and some instruments. Like so many others who fled, they were forced to leave most of their belongings behind them. Landowska's fate was shared by thousands of people in the spring and summer of 1940, when German armies invaded the Netherlands, Belgium and France. A short time after the flight, the whole of Landowska's collection of books and instruments were plundered, including a piano at which Frédéric Chopin, 100 years earlier, had composed his famous cycle of piano preludes. Wanda Landowska managed to flee to the USA via Spain. She would never see her home or most of her collection again. The picture shows Wanda Landowska in a photograph from a Moscow newspaper in 1907. The Venus de Milo by Alessandros of Antioch. The sculpture, originating from between 150 and 100 BC, was evacuated from the Louvre at the outbreak of war in 1939 and was hidden in the Chateau de Valence. To the Museum Jeu de Paume in Paris came thousands of works of art that had been looted in France. Hermann Göring visited the museum 12 times and picked out over 600 items for his collection. In total, over 22,000 stolen works of art were sent from the museum to Germany. Several leading Nazis and organizations competed for the stolen objects. Adolf Hitler had issued a special order, Führervorbehalt, which gave him precedence over the stolen art, which was gathered together for the planned Führer Museum in Linz. Art historian Hans Posse, whom Hitler appointed as curator of the museum, picked out the most important works of art. Hermann Göring, commander of the German Air Force and Hitler's deputy, also built up an extensive private art collection from looting. Hermann Göring traveled personally to Paris and Amsterdam to select art and antiquities. Other leaders, such as Hans Frank, Heinrich Himmler, Alfred Rosenberg and Joachim von Ribbentrop were also involved in the looting in various ways. The photograph shows Alfred Rosenberg. It's taken between 1933 and 1941. In Western Europe, the looting was fundamentally selective. It was exceptional for objects to be stolen from national museums, libraries and other public collections. Instead, the looting was directed at specific groups, individuals and organizations that were considered to be hostile to the regime. The most extensive looting was directed at Jewish minority. The Nazis, in their perspective, waged a specific war against the Jews who, according to them, continued with their activities even after countries like France and the Netherlands had surrendered. The raiding and confiscation of Jewish property was regarded by the Nazis as legitimate, but the looting also affected other groups. Political opponents, communists, socialists, representatives of democracy, etc. Individuals who opposed the regime, writers, journalists, artists, priests, academics, and other intellectuals. The Roma, Freemasons, homosexuals, groups of people regarded by the Nazis as inferior, Poles, Russians, Ukrainians, individuals who belonged to or helped resistant movements in occupied countries. The Nazi organizations that planned and organized the looting were important. Special units were commissioned for the task of plundering. The most important looting organization was the ERR, Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, which was placed under the Nazi Party's chief ideologist Alfred Rosenberg. The ERR had special departments in the arts, literature, archives, music and churches that focused on looting in their respective areas. It was the special section for music, Sonderstabmusik, which in 1940 plundered Wanda Landowska's home in Saint-Lô-la-Forêt. The invaluable collection was packed into 54 boxes and transported by train to Berlin. Another central organization was the National Security Authority, RSHA, with its many subdivisions such as Gestapo and the SS Security Service. The authority, which was subordinate to Heinrich Himmler, oversaw and persecuted the regime's enemies. Through its operational role, the RSHA became an important looting instrument and secured everything from bank accounts and jewelry for the art collections. Of particular interest for the organization's own operations were archives and libraries that were used in intelligence work. Thousands of political opponents and hundreds of Freemasons were plundered. The image shows a map of the ERR plundering organization's network of departments from Amsterdam to Kiev. In the East, the looting, even at the beginning, was part of the policy that formed the basis of the genocide of European Jews. Not infrequently, neighbors and locals exploited the situation and plundered Jewish property. But first and foremost, the plunder was part of an organized, planned and systematic process of degrading and anonymizing people. Valuable objects and cash were first confiscated, after which people were expelled from their homes. They were forced to give up their very last possessions in the concentration camps, before an execution command or the gas chamber. But the looting continued even after death, when the bodies were searched for gold or hidden jewelry. Plundering was not just about theft. It was a way of dehumanizing people by depriving them of their culture, history and dignity. The picture shows rings and shoes from concentration camps. Particularly ruthless was the destruction of places that the Nazis regarded as Jewish cultural centers. One such place was Vilnius, which before the Second World War was known as Eastern Europe's Jerusalem, with a Jewish population of about 100,000. The city was known for its philosophers, rabbis and poets. Not least, Vilnius was known as the center of Yiddish culture. Here was the most prominent collection of Yiddish culture in the world, at YIVO, which collected and documented Jewish history all over Eastern Europe. On the Eastern Mediterranean, there was another city which for centuries had been a Jewish cultural center, Salonika, today's Thessaloniki, in Greece. The city had been home to the Sephardic culture of the Mediterranean since the 16th century, and was largely populated by descendants of the Sephardic Jews who, in 1492, were forced to flee Spain. The medieval Spanish Jewish language of Ladino was still spoken here. Salonika was the only city in Europe where the Jewish population was in the majority. Like Vilnius, Salonika was a center of culture, language, politics and religion. And just like Vilnius, this civilization, its people and culture, would disappear through the Holocaust. Up to 90% of the Jewish population in these places were murdered, but their history and culture were also plundered and displaced. The picture shows a Jewish slave worker who sorts books at the Yiddish Scientific Institute, YIVO, which the ERR had converted into a workplace in Vilnius. For us, it was of special pride to destroy the Talmud Academy, which was known as the most prominent in Poland. From the building, we threw out the large library onto the street and shipped it to the market. There, we set fire to the library, a fire that lasted for 20 hours. Lublin's Jews, who had gathered to view it all, cried loudly. Their complaints almost heaped upon us. Then we called in the military orchestra, and the joyful cry of the soldiers silenced the Jews' complaint. German soldier about the destruction of the Talmud Academy in Lublin. Looting by the Nazis would continue to the last days of the war. From all over Europe, art, books, instruments and antiquities streamed into Nazi Germany. But neither Adolf Hitler's Führer Museum nor Alfred Rosenberg's Nazi University, Hohe Schule, came into fruition. On a smaller scale, however, work began on some of the institutions that were planned for the future. In 1941, the Institut zur Erforschung der Judenfrage, Institute for Study of the Jewish Question, opened in Frankfurt, an affiliate subordinate to Alfred Rosenberg's planned university. Many of Europe's oldest and most valuable Jewish libraries and archives were sent to the Institute. At the Institute, Nazi researchers conducted studies of Jewish history, language and culture. The purpose of the Institute was to take control of Jewish history writing in the shadow of the Holocaust. An important goal of the looting was to conquer historical source material. By plundering libraries and archives, the Nazis also aimed to take control of the victims' historical writing. The idea was to control the memory of the Jewish people after the Holocaust. At a speech at the opening of the Institute for Study of the Jewish Question in Frankfurt, 1941, Alfred Rosenberg said the following: "If the Jewish question reaches its solution in Germany, and one day across Europe, then perhaps a new generation will come after us who do not know what really happened during those decades. Our grandchildren, liberated from Jewish influence, may then fall victim to whimsical ideas and are unable to judge the power of the Jewish people over Europeans in the way we do today. The human memory is very short." One picture shows Jewish literature being sorted and studied at the Institute for Study of the Jewish Question in Frankfurt in 1942. The other picture shows an illustration from an exhibition organized by the ERR in Ratibor in 1944, allegedly showing the extensive network of the Jewish conspiracy. A witness to the destruction and looting of Jewish Vilnius was Hermann Kruk, 1897 to 1944, director of the Ghetto Library. Kruk carefully kept a diary of what he saw, hoping that one day the world would know. He writes in his diary, March 24, 1944, "I write because I have to write, as a comfort in this time of terror. I leave this as a track for future generations to follow." Kruk himself had been forced to take part in the plunder when Alfred Rosenberg's organization, ERR, created a working command of Jewish intellectuals in Vilnius. The Nazi plunderers could rarely interpret documents in Yiddish, Hebrew, Russian, Lithuanian or Polish themselves. Therefore, working commands of Jewish intellectuals were often established to handle the work. Not seldom was it librarians who had previously built up the collection, who were now confronted with the terrible choice of deciding what was to be preserved for the Nazis. In secret, Kruk and others from the working command smuggled out valuable documents, including by sewing them into their clothes. The group named itself the Paper Brigade. After the ghetto in Vilnius was wound up in 1943, Kruk was deported to a concentration camp in Estonia. On September 17, 1944, he made a final note in his diary. "I buried the manuscripts in Lagedi, in Mr. Schulman's barracks opposite the guardhouse. 6 people are present at the funeral." Not long after, Crook and 2,000 other prisoners were forced to carry wooden logs into a nearby forest. The logs were placed in long rows, and the prisoners themselves were forced to lay straight on top. After the guards shot the first prisoners in the head, a new layer of logs and prisoners was laid. Then the bodies were burned. The Czartoryski collection in Krakow was one of the foremost art collections to be looted by the Nazis. It was founded by the Polish princess Izabela Czartoryska during the 18th century. In 1939, the collection included over 5,000 works of art and antiquities, including Czartoryski's The Three Great, Raphael's Portrait of a Young Man, Rembrandt's Landscape with a Good Samaritan, and Leonardo da Vinci's Lady with an Ermine. Raphael's painting disappeared under mysterious circumstances at the end of the war. The artwork has still not been found. The book collector Isaac Leo Seligman, resident in Amsterdam, owned one of the largest and most valuable libraries of Jewish history in the world before World War II. Much of the collection came from his father, historian, bibliographer and Zionist Sigmund Seligman. The collection is believed to have included 25,000 books. Isaac Leo Seligman was deported during the war to the Theresienstadt concentration camp. In the camp, Seligman was forced into a working command of Jewish intellectuals established by the SS. The group's nickname was the Talmud Command because the prisoners were forced to sort and catalogue looted libraries. Seligman's own library was also transported to the camp, which he had been forced to catalogue for the SS. Isaac Leo Seligman survived the Holocaust and returned after the war to Amsterdam. However, large parts of his collection remained in Czechoslovakia. A few years ago, some of these books were found at the Jewish Museum in Prague, where they had lain untouched since World War II. On the back of this book is the cataloguing JB 812 that the Talmud Command did in Theresienstadt. The book comes from Sigmund Seligman's collection and contains a dedication by the book's author Arte de Magalhães Bastos. One of the most mythical objects stolen by the Nazis was the Amber Room, a chamber decorated in amber in the Catherine Palace outside St. Petersburg. The space, presented as a gift by Prussia to the Russian Tsar in the early 18th century, consisted of more than 6 tons of ornamented amber. At the beginning of October 1941, the room was dismantled by German soldiers and sent to Königsberg, today Kaliningrad. What happened to the Amber Room was never fully clarified. Most experts believe that the room was destroyed during an airstrike at the end of the war. The ruthless devastation and looting of Poland would be repeated more extensively after Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941. 3 large army groups, 4 million men, attacked the Soviet Union. Each army group was accompanied by a special force, Sonderkommando Ribbentrop, whose task was cultural looting. Just as in Poland, the Russian cultural heritage was looted and destroyed. Ukraine was particularly hard hit, but the Tsar Palace outside Leningrad, today's St. Petersburg, was also plundered and destroyed. The systematic destruction of Slavic cultural heritage was a preparation for the Nazi projects to create living space, Lebensraum, in the East for the German people. Not only the people of the East would be displaced and destroyed, but also their cultural remains. The picture shows the destruction of the Great Hall in Katarina the Great's palace in Tsarskoye Selo, outside St. Petersburg, 1941. On September 1st, 1939, Nazi Germany invaded Poland. No other single country during the Second World War would suffer as much from looting. On the Eastern Front, destruction and looting would follow one another. The war was characterized by systematic ruthlessness and cruelty, something that included the looting. Many of Poland's most important museums, libraries and collections were completely destroyed. Thousands of libraries, museums, castles, universities and private collections were plundered. Up to 90% of Poland's public libraries and school libraries were looted or destroyed. The purpose of the plunder was to deprive the Polish people of all kinds of opportunities for education and higher culture, to wipe out Poland as a nation and destroy the Polish cultural heritage. The attack on Polish culture went further than looting. Between 1939 and 1940, Intelligenzaktion, a campaign in which Polish politicians, academics, priests, teachers, musicians, athletes and other prominent Polish citizens were murdered. A list of 61,000 names of individuals who would be eliminated was set up. The campaign is estimated to have cost about 100,000 people's lives. The pictures show the wall of the Warsaw Ghetto and Warsaw in ruins. Whole societies and cultures had been devastated and obliterated. Millions of works of art, books, instruments, antiquities, items of jewelry, furniture and other personal belongings had been plundered and dispersed. Throughout Europe, the remains of this plunder of mines, bunkers, the cellars of castles and estates were to be found. Leonardo da Vinci's Lady with an Ermine, stolen in Krakow, was found at the home of the Nazi Hans Frank, former steward of the General Government of Poland. Parts of Hermann Göring's great art collection were found on an abandoned train in southern Germany, while Hitler's art collection was found in a medieval salt mine in Altaci. Outside Frankfurt and in southern Poland, tens of millions of stolen books were found, the remains of Alfred Rosenberg's project to build up a Nazi university and research system. Looting had taken on different forms on the Western and Eastern fronts. Likewise, the handling of objects after the war would also differ. Millions of items were never returned to their owners after the war. 70 years later, survivors and their descendants still struggle to regain what was stolen. The pictures show looted books in Rashiburg, Kaplan Samuel Blinder going through the looted Ratibur in the basement of the Institute of the Jewish Question in Frankfurt, and a painting, Winter Garden, by Manet. The Turgenev library was slowly reduced to smoke and ash that spread over Legnica, and shared the tragic fate with the millions of unfortunate ones who went under the fascist concentration camp and burned in the crematoria. Vladimir Sashchenko. The Turgenev Library in Paris was before the war the largest Russian-language library in the world, outside Russia. For decades, it had been the hub for Russian immigrants in Paris, from Lenin to Bunin. The Nazis transported the library to a depot in southwestern Poland. After the war, the collection was dispersed on 120,000 books, and a large part was destroyed when the books were used to warm up a Russian officer club in Poland. In Paris, there are currently hundreds of volumes of the original library left. Isaac Bensovich was responsible for the sorting of books at the Monument's Fine Art and Archives program in Frankfurt after the war. He said the following: "In the sorting room, I often came across a box of books that the sorters had compiled, which scattered shape gathered in a garden lay where books from libraries that once existed in Poland or from an extinct yeshiva. There was something tragic and sad about these volumes, as if they were whispering about a hope and longing that had long been wiped out. I've raised an exhausted Talmud that bore hundreds of names from students and scholars. Where were they now? Or rather, where were their ashes? The picture shows deposits with looted books outside Frankfurt. Over the last 20 years, 10,000 items have been returned, from the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York to the Louvre in Paris, the State Hermitage in St. Petersburg, and the Modern Museum in Stockholm. But far from all countries have honored their commitment to the Washington Principles. Over 100,000 works of art and millions of books have not yet been returned. The return of works of art, books and other objects that were looted during World War II often raises questions. Why should these items be returned? For how long will this process continue? Shouldn't Sweden, by the same argument, return books and works of art that were looted during the 30 Years' War in the 17th century? What distinguishes the Nazi plunder is that it was a part of a genocide, an ideological project to wipe out a people, not only by annihilating individuals, but also by plundering, wrecking and taking control of their culture. The Nazis intended to clear European culture from what they regarded as foreign: Jewish, Roma, Slavic literature, art, music. Restitution is, therefore, not only about providing financial compensation for what was lost. Basically, restitution is about returning and recreating some of the history and culture that was lost through the Holocaust. For many of the Holocaust survivors, restitution is about reconnecting with and obtaining redress for a family history that is characterized by this experience. I have my aunt's paintings, and I have a Persian carpet with holes in that I inherited. I have things from my dad, but I have nothing from my grandparents. I feel very emotional bound to them. I don't know what to do with the book. I just want to look at it, hold it. It was important to me. Christine Els. In 2015, Christine Els regained the book Recht, Staat und Gesellschaft. The book is the only object that has been preserved after her grandfather, Richard Kobrach. Richard Kobrach was a German lawyer of Jewish origin who lived with his wife Charlotte and the couple's 3 children in Berlin. Just before the outbreak of the war in 1939, the couple managed to send their 3 children to England. Richard and Charlotte Kobrak were first deported to the Theresienstadt concentration camp, and at the end of 1944 to Auschwitz, where they were murdered shortly after arrival. Christina's father Helmut was 19 when he arrived in England in 1939. The British authorities did not regard the teenager as a Jewish refugee. Being a German citizen, Helmut Kobrak was arrested and deported to Australia on the unknown prison ship Danera. Only in 1949 did he manage to return to England and be united with his siblings. The book was found and returned by the Central- und Landesbibliothek in Berlin. It was stolen from the family apartment in Berlin after the couple had been deported. February 1945 was the month of the secret founding, on the orders of the Soviet Union leader Joseph Stalin, of the Special Committee of the War Damages, a unit in the Red Army that would become better known as the Trophy Brigades. In a non-Nazi operation, huge amounts of material were confiscated in Germany and Central Europe. Museums, libraries, factories, universities, and arms stores were emptied. Even during 1945, 400,000 freight wagons with confiscated goods are estimated to have been returned to the Soviet Union. From the Soviet Union, the Trophy Brigades were seen as a legitimate response to Nazi destruction and looting. The Trophy Brigades also seized art, books, and other objects stolen by the Nazis. Tens of thousands of books of art and over 11 million books stolen from the Holocaust victims were transported to the Soviet Union. Places where the units from the Monuments Men in 1945 found cultural treasures that had been looted by the Nazis. The work of trying to identify and return the stolen items would last for several years after the war. In 2003, the Modern Museum in Stockholm was contacted by descendants of the German Jewish businessman and art collector Otto Nathan Deutsch. According to the family, in the museum's collection there was a painting, Blumengarten, Utenwarf, by the German expressionist Emil Nolde, which was stolen in 1939 when the family was forced to flee from Nazi Germany. The picture had been at the museum since the 1960s, when it was purchased from an auction house in Switzerland. Otto Nathan Deutsch descendants demanded to regain the painting, which for a long time was denied by the Modern Museum, claiming it had been bought in good faith. Only in 2009 did the Modern Museum enter into an agreement with the descendants to return it to them. In September 2018, the Modern Museum returned a second painting, Oskar Kokoschkas Marquis Joseph de Montesquieu Fezensac, to the descendants of the German Jewish art dealer Alfred Flechtheim. The picture shows Blumengarten by Nolde. It would take 50 years before the question of the Nazi-funded items was again on the agenda. In 1998, the Washington Conference on Holocaust-era Assets conference was organized, at which 44 countries agreed on principles for returning art and other cultural objects stolen from the victims of the Holocaust. The background was a renewed interest in addressing the unsolved problems of the Second World War following the collapse of the Soviet Union. During the post-war period, stolen works of art, books and antiquities had ended up in public and private collections around the world. Some items had been bought in good faith, but there were also a more or less organized trade in Nazi art. Few museums, auction houses and collectors asked questions about the provenance of the objects after the war. Many of those who had tried to regain their property after the war had been denied or ignored by states, museums and collectors. The Washington Principles in 1998 meant a big change. For the first time, Holocaust survivors and their descendants were able to make demands for refunds with the help of an international agreement. In Western Europe, the Allies, unlike in the West, would try to return some of the stolen objects. Responsibility for this work was given to a special unit within the Western Army, the Monuments, Fine Arts and Archives program. In Munich and Frankfurt, after the war, special sorting depots was established where the unit, which came to be called the Monuments Men, tried to identify the objects, where they had been stolen and, if possible, who had owned them. It was a least monumental task where the unit worked both under time pressure and with scarce resources. Even during the after-war years, millions of books, works of art and antiquities were returned by the Monuments Men. But the work was never completed and millions of objects never came back to their owners. The picture shows the Monuments Men returning Leonardo da Vinci's Lady with an Ermine to Poland.